welcome to the European Resilience Initiative Center video podcast. Today our guest is Besa Shahini, who is a fellow at the Hertie School in Berlin. She was born in Kosovo and served as the Minister of Education, Sports and Youth in Albania. Welcome, Besa.
Thank you for having me.
Several days ago, our PISA results have been published, and many European nations, including my nation of Germany, have been disappointed with the results. But we know that education is not only about getting knowledge or ability to read or to count, it is also about preservation of the national identity. What are your experience in preservation of identities in Albania and in Kosovo?
So, it's interesting to see the results. Albania has been a state for over 100 years, and it's managed to build a strong education system. In Kosovo, because of the recent past, and especially the way that in the 1990s, when Yugoslavia was falling apart, Kosovo did not have any sort of central financing for education, and the Albanians really tried to preserve, as you say, national identity by creating a parallel education system that had very little financing, that was sort of coming out of people's pockets. I think you still see today the results of this policy of destroying actively a whole education system, as was the case from sort of former Yugoslav institutions in Kosovo. Kosovo actually scored pretty low at the bottom of all the countries, and it's been consistently scoring low because, and I believe this, it's very difficult in such a short period of time to build a system that was consistently, attacked in a way. You say that Germany is unhappy with the results. It's still in the middle of the OECD average, and because of the pandemic and the sort of more recent issues with providing online education and providing education for students during a difficult period when schools were closed, a lot of countries actually saw backsliding. But for a country like Kosovo, the results of this recent past are seen in student results in mathematics, science, and language.
When we talk about the larger perspective from Ukraine to the Western Balkans, the Ukrainian results are also really bad because of the war and because of all the stress which internally displaced children or children who went to Europe as refugees experienced during their education. But we also know that on the Russia-occupied territories, the Ukrainian schools which continue to function in underground, they serve as a sort of refuge for those Ukrainian families who want to preserve their Ukrainian identity despite the fact of the Russian occupation and against the Russian occupation. I know that you had a very similar experience in Kosovo. How was it organized back then?
So, as I said, as Yugoslavia was falling apart, Kosovo used to be a province of Serbia, and Kosovo wanted to be more independent within Yugoslavia. So as wars were raging in Croatia and Bosnia, Kosovo declared its independence, which wasn't recognized, but the Albanians decided to organize an education system that matched with this independence. And what preceded this was a decision by Belgrade to take away from Kosovo the decision-making power on curricula. So there's two aspects to education, right? So students learn mathematics and science, and that's less ideological, but they also learn language, history, music, and these are elements of sort of national identity that if there is a conflict in place, the other side is constantly trying to sort of diminish or attack. So in Kosovo, the interesting and not often told story of resilience is the story where, as the Albanians decided to refuse Belgrade's decision to impose these curricula to teach history and Albanian language and geography and all these humanities subjects, Albanians organized themselves to create an education system where those elements would be taught to students as a way to basically come to fruition this republic that Kosovo had declared back in the 90s, but also to preserve language and to ensure that young Albanians know their history, can speak and write their language, and can exist while having their national identity. That meant that funding was cut off, and it meant that a lot of teachers and students were expelled from using public schools. So in Kosovo, a whole parallel education system was created that took place in people's basements, basically. So about a third of students of high schools, and I think a full all the students in universities had to move from public institutions into private homes that were volunteered by individuals who had space in their houses, and a whole parallel education system was created that lasted throughout the 90s until the 99 war, where Albanian students had, you know, an education that wasn't of great quality because the conditions weren't great, but that kept alive this idea of you know, what it means to be an Albanian, why there should be a preservation of national identities, and how this can be reflected in the republic that was later created.
Yeah, that resonates a lot with what we are observing in Ukraine now, and observed for decades and maybe even hundreds of years. This whole idea of how education can be used by an occupation nation to erase identity, and vice versa, how education can be used for the resistance. What is the current situation with the education in Albania and in Kosovo, and how can they invest into nation building and into creation of a better world?
There are these attempts for joint history textbooks and curriculums created for the Western Balkans. I don't know if you've seen this project that created these 4 sort of history books for teachers mainly. I think they have also student textbooks. There's a project that has tried to create these textbooks where they take same historic events and they write the perspectives from the different countries. Because, I mean, history is can be told through facts, but it's always interpreted from the perspective of the person who's telling the history, and it can change, it can vary. This organization in Greece actually brought together historians from the region, and with Council of Europe money, it's an interesting project. Unfortunately, it's not working very well in practice, but the reason why I'm telling the story is because the project in itself has a good idea behind it. So they take these common, very controversial historic events, and then they collect from the archives information to tell the story from the different perspectives. So an event that was controversial between Bosnia and Serbia, they would write in the history books both perspectives. So historians from Serbia and from Bosnia would put in their texts and allow teachers to show the students these 2 perspectives of the same historic event. there are issues, of course, with the books, because the stronger nations who have the stronger, maybe better trained historians have put in their versions more often than the weaker countries, maybe with less trained historians. But this is one problem. And the second problem is that the schools are just not using them enough. Because at the end of the day, the way that school systems are built, there's a strong sort of national curriculum, and then there's the textbooks built on those curriculums that are used in schools, and these extra resources are not necessarily used very much by teachers. But yeah, I mean, the education system, besides teaching students these basic skills to allow them to reach their full potential as adults, they do have a very strong role in building these ideas, these notions of identity, and national identity being one of those identities that students usually discover during school years.
Well, we are approaching a very interesting topic of mixed identities as a nation or as a member of a larger family like Europe. Before we go in further, don't forget to like, to share, to subscribe to this video channel, and leave your comments under this video. We're talking to Besa Shahini, who is a fellow at Hertie School in Berlin and who served as a Minister of Education, Sports and Youth in Albania. What are the perspectives of the EU for the countries of the Western Balkans? We're talking about years and over a decade of promises from Brussels.
The enlargement package of 2023 was announced just a few weeks ago, and I was very happy to see that there's this clarity by the European Commission on Ukraine and on Georgia. There's this signal that's being sent that the countries of the East do belong to this European family, and there's a speeding up of steps towards starting the process of enlargement and sort of bringing the countries closer to the EU. Now, the Western Balkans was promised sort of an EU integration process 20 years ago at this at the Thessaloniki summit, which is what's known in the community of people looking at the EU enlargement. And as always, the EU had created sort of space for enlargement just after a crisis or during crisis, and it makes sense. The EU enlargement process has been, I think, the most successful and the most effective nation building or state building, rather than nation building. It's like a state building project to help countries stabilize politically, but also develop economically. And after the wars in the Balkans, there was this idea in the EU that the countries of the Central and East Europe should be brought closer to the EU and into the EU in order to stabilize them politically, but also help with economic development. And this is now what's happening as a concept with Ukraine and Georgia. Unfortunately, what had happened in the meantime, since the promise to the Western Balkans was given, there was a financial crisis, there was a rise in populism in the different countries of the EU, and we saw a Europe that had sort of was kind of changing its mind about how quickly it wants countries to join. And when it comes to the Western Balkans, the process had really stalled. I was hoping to see that with the European Commission enlargement package now, that there would be a sign to the Western Balkans to show that the Western Balkans are going to be brought in now that there is space for Ukraine and Georgia and Moldova. But it doesn't look like that is the case. The EU is employing this process of enlargement in a very slow manner, and it's using some of the same tools that it used in the past 20 years, again in this enlargement package, and I'm not so sure that there is this enthusiasm for the Western Balkans to join the EU anytime soon.
You expressed it very politely, like you're not sure if there is enough enthusiasm. I would ask differently if there is an anger and disappointment in this reluctancy from the Brussels.
There is definitely disappointment, but I'm not so worried about the disappointment in the region. I'm more worried about what it means for the near future when it comes to both political stability and economic development in this region. So the Western Balkans is the poorest region of the continent right now, and this is where Romania and Bulgaria were before they joined the EU. We know that the EU integration process is beneficial both for the EU and the countries that join. It sends a signal to investors that this is a stable place, so then there's more money coming in and economies develop. The Western Balkans is just not getting this. So economically speaking, there is no alternative to development but joining the EU, and considering that this is not on the table in any credible way, it seems that the future of the Western Balkans is might remain as bleak as the present is. And when it comes to political stability, it's the same story. It makes sense for countries to join the EU and that offers this space for solving sort of bilateral conflicts as well. And in lacking that, I worry about the near future of the region and all of these silent sort of conflicts that we have still brewing.
This contradicts this reality with the statements of the European politicians. Like we have heard the German Minister of Foreign Affairs, Annalena Baerbock, visiting meeting of foreign ministers of the EU in Kiev last month, as she literally said that she wishes the European Union from Luhansk in eastern Ukraine to Lisbon in Portugal. And that logically includes not only the EU membership of Ukraine, but also the EU membership of the Western Balkans. And at the same time, we see this waiting room where the countries are sitting since 2 decades. Is there political will in Brussels?
So it is a set sort of number of steps that are taken in the process to joining the EU. There's this element of political willingness to open up the process of enlargement, and then there's a lot of technical work that needs to happen. Countries need to sort out the food safety systems, right? So something that is produced in Ukraine should have the same standards for health and hygiene as something that's produced in Germany in order to be part of the single market. And to get there, there's a lot of investment and work that needs to come in, which is the technical process. And this needs to happen in all spheres of sort of governance and administration. To show that the EU is really willing and ready to be open to all these different candidate countries, it must open negotiation talks with all the countries and open all these acquis chapters, right? So the acquis is this EU law that is over 100,000 pages long. Currently, the blocking of countries is happening even before the talks are opened, which is nonsense to me. Countries should be able to make progress at their own pace. However, in order to make progress, all chapters should be open, negotiations should be open with all countries, and then depending on the progress, membership should take place. So we shouldn't judge the membership date or how quick the process will be for individual countries, but to say that we're blocking countries even before opening negotiations, I think this is counterproductive and really shows that the process has not become credible or as credible as Brussels and EU capitals want us to think.
We also have seen that the European Union clearly favoritizes some countries. I remember how the EU ignored some aggressive steps from Serbia towards its neighbor Kosovo, and we remember how even the EU money which were given to Belgrade in form of buying of some trucks, for example, were used in form of these trucks for road blockades. Is it something what one can explain? Is it the lack of the clever policy, or is it indeed the idea that the EU should first accept bigger countries independently on what they're doing and then address other countries? What is the reason for that?
Look, I think going back to this idea that negotiations are not open with all countries, then there is a difference in which Brussels has a relationship with this country, right? It has a different relationship with a country that is open negotiation and it's discussing on EU acquis, and it has a different set of tools that it uses with a country that has not become a candidate country yet. Kosovo is a very specific case as well, because there's countries within the EU that haven't recognized Kosovo's statehood. So as such, the EU is not treating Kosovo as a state. And I think there needs to be some thinking there as to how to treat Kosovo equally when it's not treated as a state, or how to convince the 5 non-recognizers to recognize Kosovo. What is clear to me, though, is that unless these steps are taken and unless these challenges are overcome, the future of the Western Balkans is not looking as great as it could should there be a more credible EU integration process that would incite reforms regionally, and it would send signals to investors that this is a region that has a future in the EU and it's worthwhile investing here.
We have observed during the last year a couple of events which could be identified as tensions. Most of them on Kosovo-Serbia border, but also in some other parts of the region. Is it something what should be taken seriously as possible sparks of a future conflict? And if yes, what should the EU do to prevent a spreading of such conflict?
This is definitely the case. These conflicts that were dormant are shifting and moving. Serbia is becoming a bit more aggressive towards Kosovo. There are other areas that are put in question. The reason why these might not turn into full-blown conflict is because NATO is based in the region. It has a very strong force here and it's committed to protect. But the stability of a region should not, in principle, depend on this, right? And the EU could play a role if the EU would to give the entire region a credible EU accession process. If Serbia was to know that it can join the EU in the next decade, should it meet certain criteria, if Kosovo can start its accession process, the focus, the political focus, would be shifted towards meeting those reforms, and I have no doubt that would be more political stability in the region. The EU has all the tools in its hands. It's just because of the financial crisis and Brexit and all of what's happened in the past decade. The EU has been reluctant in using these strong tools and applying them properly to the Western Balkans.
Well, that reminds me once again on the situation in Ukraine, when you see that the lack of NATO presence have clearly led to the war, as Russia felt absolutely safe to attack Ukraine without facing any resistance, as they believed. And now we have negotiations on the EU membership, but it's impossible to say that EU membership is a very close perspective because of all the reasons you mentioned, from the food quality, control to water quality, and other aspects which are needed to be done first before the country turns into the EU member. But Are these talks to Ukraine, to Moldova and Georgia, do they push the discussion on the Western Balkan somehow into shadow, and maybe the accession of the countries of the Western Balkans can be postponed for even longer time?
I am very happy that the Commission is moving a bit faster when it comes to Ukraine, and then it sent a signal to Georgia that yes, you do belong to the European family. I hope that there would be no delays when it comes to the Eastern countries. The best sort of way forward would be for the Commission to really open negotiations with Ukraine, open up all chapters, and then let Ukraine, even though it is in the middle of a war, get the institutions to meet the criteria that it needs to in order to join the EU. Same with Georgia, same with Moldova. There is, of course, always a danger that you start the process and then there's lagging because of developments that have nothing to do with Ukraine or Georgia or Moldova. There's European elections next year. The fear is that there would be more sort of Eurosceptics coming to power, and when that's the case, there's always a slowing down of the enlargement process. So there's some of these elements that we cannot foresee, but I'm hoping that now in December the decision by the Council of Ministers would be to really move with the same speed with the speed that it started, right, with Ukraine and Georgia and Moldova. And I hope that some of this can then be extended also to the Western Balkans and see this entire sort of neighboring region as this area that should start as soon as possible to really be part of the process of EU enlargement, get the reforms undergoing, and then allow for membership as the countries meet the conditions.
But speaking of reforms, if we imagine a situation when all the countries become members of the European Union, that will be enlargement of the EU by over 50 million people and dozens of countries. Does the EU need to undergo some sort of reforms of how the decisions are being taken?
There was always debates in the EU before every enlargement as to what needs to change within the EU to make sure that this enlargement doesn't, block sort of EU functioning. So I'm sure now this conversation that is happening in Berlin and in Paris and in Brussels about what institutional reforms should take place in the EU, so it allows for enlargement, and that enlargement will not sort of block the functioning of the Union. I'm sure something will come of it. Now, to what extent will this institutional reform take place? This is unclear. There is discussions of treaty reform, which is very difficult, and it's more likely that there will be the kind of reform that is able to happen within the current treaty that gives still a lot of leeway in terms of how decisions are made within the EU, how money is spent and collected. So while enlargement process is taking place, institutional reform will definitely take place as well. I just hope that the institutional reform process is not used as a reason to slow down the enlargement process, considering that historically the EU always had to change to make way for any wave of enlargement. So this is no different now, and it's good that it's happening. It just should not hinder the process of enlargement. It can happen in parallel. The Commission is able to do both, to think through the institutional reform process, but also to allow for the enlargement process to take place.
What is what fear is bigger? Fear in Brussels, I mean, or fear that the enlargement will bring structural problems of the countries into the EU, like from economic to social problem up to other ones, or the fear that new members will become veto rights or can overvote some other countries, or that the new alliances can be built, like, for example, the German fear of a new Polish-Ukrainian alliance?
I think there's two main issues when it comes to the EU institutions and how they see enlargement. And then there's a whole other set of issues when it comes to the voters, and I'll come to that in a bit. But the institutions, I think, have their fear is that the voting process will become too cumbersome, and they might not be able to move ahead to do anything if you get more countries in, especially if they still have bilateral issues and want to block each other. And in the name of blocking each other, they can block whole sort of EU decision-making processes. And the second is money. Enlargement does cost. Of course, the financial support that has to go to Ukraine is the biggest chunk, but all the countries that would join would receive financial support that is still, it's an addition to the EU budget that is currently spent on countries that are less developed. I would argue that the financial argument is not very strong. If you look at a country like Germany, it's according to its own Chamber of Commerce, it's already losing 100 billion euros in productivity due to labor shortage. And I think an enlargement wave would offset some of this labor shortage. There would be a lot of people from these countries who can then easily work everywhere within the union, and they could improve some of these or offset some of these productivity costs. But this is a different story. Now, when it comes to the citizens, from the polls that are done regularly, it feels that there's now this support for EU enlargement towards Ukraine, and it's this sort of support for what Ukraine is doing also in protecting Europe from this war with Russia. But in principle, the concept of enlargement is linked to migration, and the voter in the EU sees migration as a threat, wrongly so, I think, because even I remember when the previous wave of enlargement, when Poland was joining, there was this concept of the Polish plumber who's coming in to take the jobs in the UK. That's not true. I mean, usually the workers who come in take the jobs that locals either don't want to do or can't do. But for the voter, enlargement is synonymous to migration, and this is what makes them the Eurosceptic voter, that is. So institutions are worried about decision-making and financing, while the voter is worried about migration.
It's scary perspective, because the policy which is being dictated by fear is never a good one. But do we have any benchmarks in the future which, in the case that they are achieved, we can say, okay, we are going into the right direction? What are these beacons of hope in the future?
Well, if after the election at the EU level, the Commission can really move forward in opening as many chapters with all of the countries that are trying to join the EU, and then allow countries to do the reforms necessary, this would be a step in the right direction. It would show that the process is credible. It takes as long as it takes, but at least the European Union is truly ready and open for enlargement to the neighborhood. And I hope to see this. I hope that there won't be too many dragging out of the process even before the process starts, even before sort of opening of chapters and opening of negotiations.
Well, let us hope for that, and the timeline is not so long. Like, we will see the elections to the European Parliament in next year, so the answer will come pretty fast. Thank you so much for this moving interview. It was Besa Shahini, who is a fellow at Hertie School in Berlin. She was born in Kosovo and she served as a Minister of Education, Sports and Youth in Albania. Thank you so much, Besa.
Thank you.
And don't forget to like, to share and to subscribe to this channel and wait for the next interviews.